Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the comeback album from the Jonas Brothers called Happiness Begins. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I missed the Jonas Brothers. Not that I wanted them to come back or have got any sort of fond nostalgia for the group. I literally had to check to see that they weren't a part of High School Musical or something, even if they did come out of the same Disney pop factory that gave us Miley and Demi, but they were a little after my time. I legitimately missed them. Strange that they missed my preteen years where I was an open fan of Hilary Duff and my university years where I was an open fan of Glee, but they were pumping out over-polished basic pop rock where my taste even then were a little bit more refined. You know, Fall Out Boy, Boys Like Girls, Simple Plan, that kind of thing. But alright, bad jokes aside, I've always had a little bit of distance towards the whole Jonas Brothers thing. It wasn't really in my lane. When You Look Me in the Eyes was a good power ballad, sure, but the production has always been mediocre at best, and the band never brought a convincing edge or flair in their writing to bear. Not helped by Nick Jonas needing a couple of years to really grow into his voice, when he then promptly became an underwhelming solo act. And I honestly expected nothing more to come out of the Jonas Brothers group. Joe Jonas had gone on to his underwhelming pop-funk group, DNCE. The third one, I think his name is Kevin. He went on to a bunch of reality shows, and let's be honest, irrelevance would have hit these guys once any of them turned 30. And then Sucker became a radio behemoth riding off of safety and nostalgia, and suddenly there was a terrible follow-up single with Cool, and a new album that's waiting in the wings, and I'm stuck with a project that all the buzz was predicting was a multi-genre clusterfuck, not helped by the presence of executive producer Ryan Tedder. And look, Ryan Tedder has done great work in the past, but he's fallen off considerably since the 2000s, and given that I've got no real nostalgia for this group, I wasn't going to treat this with a lot of kid gloves, and hey, shouldn't that be what the band wants? But fine, what do we get from Happiness Begins? Well, this project is both more and less interesting than it should be. On the one hand, it would be very easy for me to say, it's just another Jonas Brothers album just updated for the modern era, with what could be serviceable pop music crippled by bad production, weak writing, and lead performances lacking the punch or flair to carry a more distinctive album. But on the other hand, this is an album that has everything to gain by banking on nostalgia and a major charting single. I'd argue they're almost playing with house money here, so you would think they would take every opportunity to deliver the most polished product to date, so the fact that this album sounds like so much of a cheap, sloppily produced cash-in is kind of alarming, and kind of disappointing too. In other words, this probably should be better than it is, and a little bit perversely fascinated why it's not all that good at all. Now granted, part of this involves a conversation surrounding how, let's be honest, the Jonas Brothers were never that good to begin with, either together or in their solo ventures. But while I have never liked DNCE, there have been songs from the band and the solo ventures that I have liked. So what's the factors that made those work? Well, a big part of this is that as much as Nick Jonas wanted to be Justin Timberlake, but with more of a colorless instrumental palette behind him, when he had a good groove, he could at least bring a veneer of cool, or at least impassioned sincerity to the table, which is coincidentally the big reason why When You Look Me in the Eyes was a really good song. But I also argue that if you're expecting the Jonas Brothers to position themselves as a rock band instead of a pure pop act, which, you know what, might be a reasonable assumption coming off of Sucker that tries to be a pop rock thing, you might miss that just because you shoved guitars in their hands a decade ago doesn't mean that the Jonas Brothers are that far removed from similar tones that even the Backstreet Boys pursued in the 2000s. Hey, you know what? Ironically, if you remember that album that the Backstreet Boys put out this year, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, you can definitely hear some sonic parallels with Happiness Begins, especially in the genre pile-up, the vocal harmonies that are more dependent on pitch correction and reverb than they really should be, and ultimately a derivative lack of clear direction that's not helped by a lot of bad trends endemic to mainstream pop right now. And unlike the Backstreet Boys, there's very much a clear leader in Nick Jonas. That means whenever the other two are given more space, the songs immediately lose a lot of presence and balance, especially with some of Joe's more woozy delivery that's not all that impressive or tight. And yes, I'm as tired of saying it as ever, especially as I feel like I have hammered on this point for years now. But once again, we have a pop album where for the majority of the songs, the melody is consigned to the back of the mix, the percussion is placed right up front with the vocals, and we're stuck relying so heavily on them for the hook and the tune. And if you're someone who's already not that impressed by the stage presence, and especially the falsettos from these guys, it's kind of hard not to feel like many of these songs, they're just underwhelming. They're not that interesting, especially with abbreviated track lengths, or in some cases, hooks that just will not materialize, which is kind of a bad sign when you have 14 tracks and the weird feeling that you might have good enough hooks for maybe half of them, more likely a third. But take one of the few exceptions to this formula, Only Human, with its cushion of squonking horns and gauzy synth. And am I the only one who thinks that the hook never really quite takes off, and that the song's missing a bridge or something to fill out the other half of the song? And keep in mind, this sort of more stripped back, percussion over melody approach, it works best when there are cushions of reverb in order to flesh out more of the atmosphere, at least give the melody a bit more presence, or at the very least some well-mixed grooves. And this is where the Jonas Brothers unfortunately strike out, and they strike out hard. Now granted, I'm not surprised when you hear from Ryan Tedder that this is a group that writes a song in 90 minutes, cuts it in an hour later, and then you have a demo done by the day's end. But wouldn't it kill somebody to maybe bring in a second or third take here, or at the very least competently mix the percussion so it doesn't sound like ass? Because not only is there zero consistency between the live drums and the programmed drum machines that sound as stale and clunky as ever, you also somehow get some really slapdash drum mixing, where it sounds like rough fuzz and scratchiness in the mix was left in for no coherent reason. And it's not attempting a rock or a lo-fi vibe, it sounds like a rush job where nobody went back to polish anything and then try to pass it off as genre bending or experimental. And it gets particularly grating with how tinny everything was mixed on Happy When I'm Sad, which sounded like the Jonas Brothers tried to write an AJR song and somehow failed. And that's right before you get the obese trap clunker of Trust, where the groove and the vocal layering somehow sound muddy, glassy, and weirdly zany at the same time, and it's flat out atrocious. Now, the few places where things might have clicked with this formula are Don't Throw It Away and Strangers with the 80s synth foundation, the firmer Rollick, and the very obvious attempts to rip off the 1975, but you would think that a sharper low-end groove would come through, or the falsetto leads would be better layered without such obvious compression. But even songs that show a little bit more refinement, they feel like baffling, go-nowhere genre experiments. I've already talked about Sucker and the disaster that is Cool on Billboard Breakdown, but why does every single time sound like a 2014 Magic COD reggae song produced by Greg Kurstin? Why does Hesitate sound like a Shawn Mendes riff and not a good one? Roller Coaster sound like a stab at an Avicii song circa 2013? And Love Her sound like a rejected Ed Sheeran song that bizarrely reminds me of She's Always a Woman to Me by Billy Joel with some of its curdled condescension? And you know what? I guess that has to take us to the lyrics and songwriting. And look, I think even the fans, they can admit nowadays, even with the benefit of nostalgia, that the Jonas Brothers were never a particularly deep or lyrical act. They were probably saddled with the Disney mandate that they couldn't afford to get all that sexual or transgressive or interesting, or they get shipped off for reprogramming. But you know what? I have given Nick Jonas some credit for some moderately clever songwriting in the past that punches above in pop. And thus it's a goddamn shame how underwhelming so many of these songs are on a lyrical level, either falling into overwrought love song, mildly interesting breakup song, and then outright disaster, which is where you can deposit junk like Cool or Happy When I'm Sad, which almost seem like parodies for as basic and faintly embarrassing as they really do feel. And you know what? When you don't have that much sophistication or unique language in your writing, which also doesn't help a lot of these songs stand out from each other, another big issue, and the other vocal lines are the most prominent melodic feature of these songs, you wind up clinging to the bare minimum of the elements that do stand out. They are all the more glaring. Yeah, I believe it's a pretty basic 80s inspired love song, but the groove, the vocal harmonies, they kind of connect. Thus it winds up as one of the few album highlights. Hell, I might even be forgiving of the Hail Mary of Don't Throw It Away if you didn't get the line of how her mind is messing with her head again. It's that similar sour note that runs through Love Her that's kind of condescending, but not intentionally. And that's the weird thing. It doesn't feel intentional intentional to add complexity to these songs. They're all being sold with complete sincerity in a lot of the writing and the framing through their delivery, which is one reason why The Wonder of Strangers, or even the completely straightforward, desaturated plea of Comeback, they kind of work in what they're trying to do, even if they are really basic and kind of derivative. Now on the flip side though, if they were thinking that a song like Trust or even Sucker would shed the very sexless sheen that's always been attached to this group since the beginning, they feel so desperate and airless that they completely lack any sort of the convincing sensuality, and it's all the more obvious. But as a whole, folks, you know what? I'm kind of at a loss on what this album really adds to mainstream pop right now. Not only are significant chunks of this shamelessly derivative, I'd argue that it's not even competently produced or interestingly written to stand out in the middle of the pack. And I guess that shouldn't be any surprise if these guys are chasing the obvious nostalgia dollar and they need something to play in between the hits when they're on tour. But this feels slapdash and weightless even by their standard. And you know what? I can't even say that it's sterile or uninteresting enough because of the sheer number of missteps that it makes and the choices that have to be heard to be believed. Now, a lot of them are bad, but a few like Believe, Don't Throw It Away, and Strangers, they're kind of good. But look, they're not enough to save this from getting a very strong 4 to 10 and not really a recommendation. Folks, even if you grew up with the Jonas Brothers or are buying into some of the radio hype right now, there's better pop music than this that actually has more flavor. And these guys, they have sold plenty enough albums, they don't need another cheap paycheck from you. In other words, come on folks, you can skip this. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. If you're surprised that I talked this long about the Jonas Brothers, well, yeah, you're not the only one. But hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down in the description below. And I got the poll up there for the Jonas Brothers fans. Tell me how wrong I am, even though you look back on this album in a couple years, I'm fairly certain I won't be. But hey, beyond that, anything else I may be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you're looking for a Billboard breakdown where I did talk about these songs, the link is over here in the card over here, where Billboard breakdown is on its own new channel from going forward. It's been like that for a couple months now, just a friendly reminder. But hey, till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.